Welcome to week 8 of Learning to Fly. We're now almost 2 months in, but so far we've been making small changes with the aim of supporting students in making decisions and moving towards independence. In the next few weeks, we're going to be focusing on how to introduce more freedom. But when we do that, it's important to make sure that the lesson is recognisable to students. If they think that they're doing something new or special, they can take that as a sign to ignore the routine or the rules and can sometimes lose focus and control. For this reason, our keyword this week is anchor. We need our learners to stay anchored. An anchor keeps us grounded and it stops us from floating off and getting lost. It represents stability and security, and it's a point of reference to keep us on track. But what is an anchor in the classroom? Well, it depends. Really, it's anything that provides security. It could be your classroom routines. It could be your course book. It could be your lesson plan. That would be your anchor, not your students'. It could be a visible lesson menu. Some of you may be aware that I follow an inquiry-based approach with my primary groups where we work on projects. Each inquiry has an essential or driving question that students need to answer by the end of the unit of work. And this essential question could also be considered an anchor because it reminds students constantly of what they're aiming to do. What I'd like you to do is to think of the things that are constant in your classes. I shared some examples just now, but for you it may be something else. So make a list of anchors, things that always stay the same in every lesson. You may have a lot, or you may just have 2 or 3, but I'd like you to pause the video now and make a list of your anchors. You may also find it helpful to draw a picture of an anchor near your list. Okay, so have you got your list of anchors? Right, so now as we introduce more activities and freedom into our lessons as we go forward, I want you to keep your anchors, or at least some of them if you have a lot. You can always release some of them gradually if you feel that they're restricting your students' progress. We're now going to think about open-ended tasks. Open-ended tasks allow that freedom that we've been talking about. They give learners a chance to be creative and make decisions and choices. But they can also be quite scary to some learners, and you may find that some students feel lost and don't really know what to do. Let's look at an example of an open-ended task. Now, I've given my students an activity very similar to this before now, but there are problems with it, and in fact it isn't really an activity, it's just an instruction. While some students may be okay with a task like this, many will struggle because it's too open and there's no support or scaffolding. Some students might attempt to write a story, but it probably isn't going to be a very good one. However, we don't want to restrict students too much or clip their wings. So how can we make it easier for students to be successful with this story writing task? Here are some ideas. You could talk about bad days first and generate some ideas from the class. You could give students some words to include in the story. You could provide a story structure, so maybe you could give them a graphic organizer like a story mountain or something like that to help with the planning. You can give students some ideas to choose from, so maybe you could give them some settings, some characters, some objects and some events to choose from. You can provide a list of success criteria. You could set a word limit or a range, or maybe a number of sentences or paragraphs that you want them to write. And you can set a time limit for each stage. So the stages could be idea generation and planning, and then writing a first draft, editing, creating a final draft. Do you think that any of these could be considered anchors? Well, I think they could all be anchors, although they're not necessarily things that we do in every lesson. And of course, you wouldn't do all of these things. You would choose those that you think would work best for your students. The same goes for an open-ended speaking task, such as a role play. Providing structure for open-ended tasks can actually make a big difference. So now for an activity. This time it isn't an activity for your students, but for you. When you're planning your next lesson, I want you to try to include an open-ended task. It could be a speaking activity or a writing activity, or maybe you ask students to make something. If possible, make sure that it relates to your lesson topic so that students have the language that they need. And also, this is another way of anchoring the activity. Then think about how you could scaffold the activity or provide guidance. You could make a list of steps, you could provide a worksheet, whatever you think works best for your activity and your students. You could also make it optional so that students only use this support if they need it. Finally, this week's tip is to make sure that any visual support or guidance is visible to everyone so that they don't have to ask for it. You could write any visual support on the board, or you could display it on a poster. That way you're supporting students without forcing it on them. You're allowing students to make the decision whether they want to use the support or not. And this is a big step in the right direction towards learner independence.